Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Red Pill Garage. On today's episode of Red Pill Garage, I'll be working on a 2010 Mitsubishi Lancer. Can you guys see what the problem is? I'll give you a hint. Have a look at inside the wheel. What do you see? I'll give you another hint. There's a brake hose clamp on the brake hose. How about now? Can you see the problem? We have a missing brake pad. Have a look at the damage to the disc. You're most likely thinking, how did that happen? The young lady that owns this car told me about a month ago she had a full service done, a pink slip and 2 new tyres on this car. Then about 2 weeks later after driving, she heard a grinding noise, so she rang up the mechanic and the mechanic said there's nothing wrong with the brakes. So she continued to drive it for 2 weeks like that, causing the brake pad to wear so thin, resulting in the brake pad to fall out, then the piston, and then the brake pedal hitting the floor. Man, this mechanic's in a lot of trouble. On today's job I'll be using an impact gun, brake cleaner, WD-40, water, brake fluid, a buffing toolkit, torque wrench, a hammer, an air drill, anti-seize grease, Loctite and a ceramic anti-seize grease, brake caliper piston compressing tool, a brake hose clamp, a couple of hooks, 17 and 14mm ring spanners, breaker bar, a 14mm ring spanner, 8mm spanner, 17 and 14 spanner ratchets, a scraper, a couple of screwdrivers, a brush, safety glasses and a catch can for our brake fluid. First thing, I'm going to remove the wheel. Okay, next I'm going to wash the inside of that wheel to get rid of all that brake fluid, otherwise if it's left there it's going to eat all the paint off the inside of that wheel. That wheel's actually painted black. So we want to give it a thorough wash, just with water only. You don't need any degreaser, just water only. Brake fluid's biodegradable. By hitting it with water, neutralizes it and destroys it. If you ever to get brake fluid on your paintwork, never wipe it off, just wash it off with water. Otherwise if you left it there, it certainly would eat the paint off the car. Here's the view from the front side of the caliper. That's the piston. And that's the actual disc rotor itself. This is the other side. I just wanted to show you this camera angle here to see how much metal has been removed from the disc. Next I'm going to remove the driver's side wheel. I wanted to show you guys the inner and outer lip on this disc. It's so worn down. It's got a huge lip on it, on the inside and the outside. It should be totally flat. To get the best performance out of your brake pads, whenever your brake pads need replacing, you should get your discs machined or replaced. On the driver's side, the inner and outer disc surfaces, you can see they're pretty much the same thickness in comparison to the passenger side. Back over to the passenger side, I'm going to remove the brake hose mounting bolt. If you remember in the beginning of the video, I already had a hose clamping off the brake hose. Whenever unscrewing this type of bolt, make sure not to lose the copper washers. They're made out of copper for a reason. Copper itself is soft and makes a good seal. And now it's time to remove the caliper guide pins. What you want to do is first crack them loose, then you can get your spanner ratchet. You can take them off nice and quick that way. When removing your caliper guide pins, it's really important not to get them mixed up. This one here has a rubber sleeve. That rubber sleeve is very important. It stops the brake pad from wearing on an angle and also quietens down any caliper noise. And now the bottom one. And you can see this one here, there's no rubber sleeve on it. And now the caliper can be totally removed off the car. And you can see that brake caliper piston's loose, it's actually come out completely. That's a pretty rare sight to see that. Here's another angle of the damage done to the disc. Now I'm going to remove the brake pad. She's certainly got her money's worth out of that brake pad, or what's left of it. That's almost down to the bare metal itself. Next, I'll be removing the bolts holding the caliper cradle bracket in place. Once you've cracked them loose, you can use a spanner ratchet to take the bolts out quickly, or if you have an air ratchet you can also use that as well. Next, over to the driver's side, I'll be cracking the caliper guide pin bolts. Then I'll be using a spanner ratchet to remove them out a bit quicker. Okay, no rubber sleeve on the bottom guide pin. And there's our rubber sleeve on the top guide pin. Okay, it's time to remove the caliper and tuck that out of the way for now. And next, our brake pads. That's pretty thin. It's probably about 1/2 millimeter left on that. And the outer pad. And now cracking loose the caliper cradle bracket bolts. And use a spanner ratchet. Take them out a bit quicker. Okay, now I can securely mount the brake caliper out of the way, and this will stop it from falling, damaging any ABS wire or brake hose. Okay, next I'll be spraying a little bit of WD-40 around the hub disc surface area. That joint there usually rusts out and they can be a bit difficult to get off. Now I'll be using a hammer here because the disc is going to be thrown away anyway, but under normal circumstances, if you're going to remove a disc for any other job, never hit it with a steel hammer. You can use a rubber mallet. Okay, I'm going to use WD-40 again where the disc meets the hub. Spray around that area there. They're always pretty stubborn to come off. Here comes the fun bit. You've got to bash this off pretty good. Now it's probably generated so much heat it's almost welded itself on there. So it's going to need a few more good hits until it dislodges itself. Finally. And there you have it. Okay, now that I have the discs side by side on the bench, you can actually see how much damage there is in comparison to the driver's side disc. And there's the caliper itself. I'm going to have to overhaul that caliper. I'll give that piston a good clean up and we might be able to salvage that piston. Now it's time to hit that wheel bearing hub with a bit of lubricant so I can give it a good clean up with our hub buffing tool. Okay, now I'll be switching the fittings on the hub buffing tool to clean the wheel studs. That's actually an internal wire brush. And there's the steel bristles. Next I'm going to hit it with a bit of brake cleaner. Get rid of all that crud. We want a nice clean flat surface on there. This part is critical because we don't want any disc thickness variation or brake pulsation or steering oscillation caused by dirt trapped on that wheel bearing hub. If there was any dirt trapped on that surface, it would cause this disc to sit on an angle, not true and flush. I actually explained this in my last video. There's a better view of that internal wire brush. And the same process on this side again. Cleaning the wheel studs is quite important. Things like this most mechanics don't even think about doing. It's quite common in our industry to have wheel nuts seize up and then the only way to get them off is to force and break them off. This is very inconvenient for the mechanic that's working on the car and then having to give the owner the bad news and the extra cost. Imagine if you were to get a flat tyre and then to make things worse you were forced to break the wheel stud and nut off. You can see how quick that brake cleaner is evaporating off that hub surface. And there's the difference between the old disc and the new disc. You can see there's a good couple of mil there difference in height. And you can see the difference there with the brake pads. Much thicker. That fourth brake pad's gone missing in action. Okay, what I'm going to do now is measure up the new disc for correct fitment to make sure they match the old parts. So make sure the diameter is the same. and make sure it fits on the wheel bearing hub and all the studs line up. It's perfect. So we know it's the correct part. Whenever fitting new discs to the car, you always want to make sure you give them a good clean and wipe with brake cleaner and a clean rag, as when the new discs are manufactured they give them a coat of oil or a type of wax to stop them from rusting in storage or whilst in transport. That coating can act as a lubricant, causing poor brake performance. Okay, now it's time to fit the brake disc, and to help secure it down so it doesn't move around like that, I screw a wheel nut on, and you'll see how easy that wheel nut is to screw on. That's because I cleaned up the threads before. Okay, now it's time to lubricate the caliper cradle bracket, and there's two types of greases that I like to use. One's Copper Ease. It's a very good product. It's almost 1100 degrees Celsius it can withstand. Another good product is this Performance Synthetic Lubricant. Now when lubricating these caliper cradle brackets, you want to make sure you fully coat the inside there with that lubricant, and not to put too much in there, just to cover enough. Next I'm going to use some thread locker for the caliper cradle bracket bolts. You can use medium strength in this application also. On goes the caliper cradle bracket. Just a couple of drops, that's all you need. It quickly spreads around the threads. Okay, now it's time to grab our 17mm ring spanner and tighten up these bolts. You want to make sure these bolts are fairly tight. And now it's time to fit our brake pad wear indicator clips onto the brake pad. Now you want to make sure you put them in the same position as where the old ones were on the old brake pads. Now these wear indicator clips normally sit on the inside pads only. And the reason for this is because the inside pads usually cop a bit more wear and tear. And that's because this is called a floating caliper. There's only one piston per caliper, not two pistons per caliper, like on a fixed caliper, not a floating caliper. As you can see, there's no wear indicator clip on the outside brake pad. Okay, now it's time to remove the brake fluid reservoir cap. Okay, now it's time to compress the brake caliper piston, and when doing so, because the fluid is going in the reverse action, it goes back into the brake fluid reservoir, and that's why we remove the cap. And now I'm going to use the brake caliper piston compressing tool, and that's going to push the piston back in. Now when doing so, you've got to do this slowly. If you do it too fast, the fluid will rush into the reservoir bottle too quickly and can squirt out onto the fenders and damage the paintwork on the car. And there you have it, one compressed brake caliper piston. Next I'm going to fit the brake caliper, and the upper caliper guide pin has a rubber sleeve on it, and if you've noticed there's no grease on the guide pin, because if I was to grease that, pushing it in would wipe all that grease off. That's why earlier I actually greased the caliper cradle bracket. Now I'm going to use a couple of drops of the thread locker. Just a couple of drops on the threads, that's all you need. And the same with the bottom one as well. Just a couple of drops. Now we can fully tighten those caliper cradle guide pins in place. If you have a closer look at that caliper guide pin at the bottom, you can actually see the head on it is damaged. And that's because somebody's rounded it off, so I'm forced now to use a single hex socket. Otherwise, if I was to use a normal spanner on there, I'd round it off even more. And now that the caliper is nice and tight, we want to make sure it's freely moving. And this is where we get the name floating caliper. And now it's the same process for the other side. We're going to give it a thorough clean and then fit it to the wheel bearing hub. Two nice clean surfaces, and that wheel nut should screw on there very easily because we previously cleaned it before. Okay, next we're going to tighten up those caliper cradle bracket bolts. I've already previously Loctited these bolts with thread locker. And next we're going to fit the brake pads, and you can see the brake pad wear indicator clip on there. It's very important not to forget that. That's going to tell us when the brake pads are running low. It will give off a high pitched squeal. And there's our reconditioned caliper. It turned out well. I managed to salvage that piston, as previously I thought that piston was no good, but the actual damage that I thought it had was metal that had transferred from the disc rotor onto the piston. So once I gave it a clean up, it barely left a mark on there. I ended up replacing those rubbers as it came in the kit for the caliper overhaul. On goes the caliper and the bottom guide pin and the top. Make sure the rubber sleeve's on the top one, and a couple of drops of thread locker. Like I said, you can also use medium strength. And now it's time to tighten our caliper guide pins. And now you want to make sure our floating caliper wants to float side to side. And now it's time to fit the brake hose, and make sure you have your copper washers on there. So make sure the surfaces are nice and clean. Now when bolting down these bolts, you want to make sure you don't over tighten them because they're not a solid bolt. It's got an oil gallery there for the oil or the brake fluid to pass through. So the bolt itself is not as strong as a regular bolt, so you want to make sure you don't break it off. And now it's time to fill up our brake fluid reservoir, because we're going to start to bleed the brakes now. When bleeding your brakes, you always want to start with the longest line from the brake master cylinder, then finish with the shortest. In other words, on this car I'm going to start with the left hand rear because the master cylinder is on the right side of the car, then the driver's side rear, then the left hand front, then to finish off with the shortest line, the driver's side front. Okay, once you've cracked your caliper bleed nipple loose, it's now time to fit the hose for your brake fluid catch can. And you want to make sure the hose is higher than the brake caliper because any air bubbles will float to the top. When bleeding a car's brake system, it's always best to give it quarter pumps. Never push the brake pedal all the way to the floor. Otherwise you could damage the brake master cylinder, and that could be a real problem. And when that happens, what you'll find, you'll never have a solid brake pedal. The brake pedal will always sink to the floor, like it's got air in the system. And then to resolve that problem, you have to replace the brake master cylinder, which is very expensive. Okay, once there's no more air in the system, you can nip up the nipple, remove the hose, and once you've removed the hose, you can fully tighten up that brake bleed nipple. Once you've done that, you can give it a squirt of water to break down that brake fluid, and then you can put the rubber cover onto the bleed nipple. Okay, next step, we've got to fill up that reservoir again because we don't want to run out of brake fluid. We still don't know at this stage if the owner of the car has caused any damage to the ABS system or letting it run dry. We'll soon find out. Okay, now that our brake master cylinder reservoir is full, we can start bleeding the right hand rear brake caliper. Crack that nipple loose. Fit the hose on there, and don't forget to make sure the hose is higher than the brake caliper so the air bubbles rise to the top. When I do a brake fluid flush, I normally pump about 24 quarter pumps, just so I know that the brake master cylinder reservoir is not going to run out of brake fluid, and I use that as a guide. Once there's no more air in the system, you can close off the brake nipple and remove the hose, and now you can fully tighten up the brake bleed nipple. Put the cap on the nipple, and just wash any excess off with water. Fill up our brake fluid reservoir bottle again. Next, I'm going to remove the brake hose clamp. Now you'll see all the air come out of that, because that caliper is totally dry. You can see all those little air bubbles coming through. Once I'm satisfied with that, I can close off the nipple and get ready to start on the driver's side. Don't forget to fill up the reservoir again before you start on the driver's side. And the same process continues on the driver's side. Hopefully after all this, we should get a nice solid brake pedal. If not, we have to bleed the ABS via a scan tool. And if that doesn't work, we may have to replace the brake master cylinder. And finally, we're going to tighten the brake bleed nipple. cover, and finally some water to wash off any excess brake fluid. Hopefully this is the final top up, providing there's no other problems with the brake system. Once the cap's on there, you can give it a splash of water just to make sure there's no brake fluid hanging around. And finally, the moment of truth. We're going to find out if we have success. Do we have a solid pedal, or do we have a pedal that goes to the floor? It looks like we have a solid pedal. Lucky for her. Oh, that's great. Okay, and now it's time to fit our wheel, but before we do that, we're going to lubricate our wheel studs with some WD-40. Now when doing this, only half press the trigger and point in a downward action so you don't spray any lubricant on the disc surface. As you can see, I only nip up the wheel nuts, I never do it tight with the rattle gun. If you guys watched my last video, tightening the wheel nuts too tight is one of the main causes of DTV. And the same process goes for the other side as well. I'm going to show you guys how to properly tighten up your wheel nuts. Start at the 12 o'clock position, number 1, then number 2, 3, 4 and finally 5. You want to go in a star action, not in a circular action. On this particular car, the factory torque settings for the wheel nuts are 108 Newton meters. And that clicking noise you hear, that's the torque wrench telling me not to push any further. The same goes on this side. Start at the 12 o'clock position. 1, 2, 3, 4 and finally 5. You can hear the torque wrench clicking again. That's telling me not to push any further than that. If you own a Japanese car, or even a Korean made car, there's a very strong possibility it has the same brake system and design or similar to it than this 2010 Mitsubishi Lancer. So that means you can actually change the brake pads and the discs yourself if you follow these simple instructions and not get ripped off like this lady did. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And if I can help you out with your car issues, you can leave a comment down below. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode of Red Pill Garage.